He gets his chance in 1809, when, for reasons best known to themselves, the Austrians decide to take Napoleon on again. And they are well and truly crushed. It's a very hard-fought campaign, but Napoleon wins it. He now has the Austrians completely at his mercy. And basically, one of the conditions for peace was that Napoleon marries Marie-Louise, who's the daughter of the Habsburg Emperor, Napoleon's old rival and enemy, Francis I. So at that point, Josephine has to go.
Josephine left the Tuileries Palace forever to live at their old marital home at Malmaison. She was given the title Queen of Navarre and furnished with an exorbitant allowance. Despite her treatment, she and Napoleon remained close friends. Marie-Louise bore Napoleon a son within the first year of their marriage, and little Napoleon was crowned king of Rome. But Napoleon's dream of a Europe united against Britain was under threat.
Napoleon wants to create a great pan-European blockade to basically kill British exports and to starve Britain out. He needs Russia to help him there. And for a time it works. But by 1811-12, it's very clear that the Tsar of Russia, Alexander, doesn't see eye to eye with Napoleon in this campaign of economic attrition against the British. And it's to enforce that that Napoleon invades Russia in 1812.
Napoleon marched on Moscow, but the Russians refused to give battle. The Tsar's armies scorched the earth as they retreated, leaving the Cossacks to hack at Napoleon's rear and flanks. At last, the Russians turned to face their enemy at Borodino. Napoleon claimed a narrow victory, but entered Moscow to find it deserted and in flames.
Mountains of red rolling flames like immense waves of the sea. Oh, it was the most grand, the most sublime, the most terrifying sight the world ever beheld.
The Russian tactics forced Napoleon to turn back.
Napoleon's problem when he invades Russia wasn't that he was slapdash, it was that he was too careful. He set up huge supply bases behind his lines, which he hoped would cover a winter retreat. He can't protect his lines. They're too far extended, they're too long. The Cossack cavalry get in behind him, so that when Napoleon starts to retreat from Moscow, he gets to his next supply base, and there's nothing to eat, because the Cossacks have had it for lunch and then disappeared. The army was already in tatters even before the retreat began.
The losses were astronomical. Napoleon went into Russia with 600,000 men and came out with less than 60,000. It was a devastating blow.
The trouble is that almost all his cavalry's been lost in Russia. All the horses are dead and he can't follow them up. Eventually, the Allies bring him to battle in Leipzig. It's called the Battle of the Nations because it's when the Russians, the Prussians, and the Austrians come together against him.
Napoleon was resoundingly defeated at Leipzig. It had been the one battle Napoleon could not afford to lose, and now that he had, his days as ruler of France were numbered. In Paris, his enemies were waiting.
He's offered very good peace terms. He refuses them because he thinks he can win. And it's at that point his brother Joseph, his ex-foreign minister Talleyrand, his minister of police Fouché, and the French Senate betray him. They force him to abdicate. And so he has to surrender power, and the Allies ship him off to Elba. But it wasn't a military defeat.
Marooned off the coast of Italy, Napoleon longed to return from exile. In France, the restoration of the Bourbon monarchy was causing fear of a return to the inequalities of the past and widespread civil unrest. Napoleon devoured the news from Paris and knew he had to escape from Elba. The Allies, it would seem, had vastly underestimated their man.
Napoleon, being Napoleon, decides to take a chance. He simply hijacks an English ship with some of his guard and sets out for the French coast. When the news gets out that he's back, Louis XVIII sends down one of Napoleon's oldest friends, Marshal Ney, guy who's been with Napoleon from the beginning. Ney tells Louis XVIII that he'll bring Napoleon back in an iron cage. When he comes face to face with him, he just breaks down and cries and takes his troops over. That's the beginning.
A vast crowd cheered his arrival at the Tuileries Palace. The army immediately rallied to him. Napoleon knew he would need every soldier he could muster because the British and Prussian armies were in Belgium, preparing to strike. Waterloo would be the setting for Napoleon's final conflict.
The Waterloo campaign is Napoleon's last gambler's throw. He stakes everything on the Army of the North, smashing up to Brussels and getting between the Prussians and the British-led coalition with the Dutch. Napoleon attacks, as Wellington says, "Damn me, the fellow's just a mere pounder after all." He tries the only tactics he can, hey diddle diddle, straight up the middle, bash a hole with his artillery. It doesn't work. From that moment on, he's doomed. The Anglo-Prussian army eventually close like a trap on him. And then it's a rout.
Napoleon immediately fled back to Paris. He thought he could go on, but he had not bargained on the final act of betrayal by his ministers. They forced him to abdicate. Napoleon Bonaparte surrendered himself to Captain Maitland of the British Royal Navy, who introduced him to his men as the greatest man the world has ever produced. But despite the kind words, the Allies were taking no chances with Napoleon at this time.
Napoleon's second exile wasn't in the least like his first. Elba was a very pleasant place to be sent. This time the Allies have learnt their lesson, and they decide to send Napoleon to the most remote, inaccessible place they can find. That's the island of St. Helena.
He is a broken man. He realises he's being put on a rock in the South Atlantic. He gets a series of dreadful messages, and his whole life comes unglued. He's no longer master of France, he's no longer master of Europe. Josephine dies, he's broken about that. Perhaps most tragically of all, Marie-Louise never gets to visit him. The Austrians have kept her well away, and the King of Rome never gets, his son never gets to visit. So his family, his dynasty, the very thing he's striven all his life to achieve, is stripped from him.
Napoleon Bonaparte died in May 1821 at the age of 52. Some maintain he was poisoned by a French assassin, but most likely he died of stomach cancer. He was buried on St. Helena in a humble grave, but his last wish was to be buried in his beloved Paris. Eventually, the body was returned to the city, and a magnificent tomb was constructed at Les Invalides, in honor of the greatest soldier France has ever seen.
The legacy he leaves is the legacy I think we see today, a united Europe. That was Napoleon's dream, under a French civil service, a single currency, a single set of laws, all driven by the French administrative dream. And I suppose the irony is, not 12 miles from those rather soggy fields of Waterloo, it stands the European Commission headquarters today. The final laugh might be that it's not Wellington, the conqueror's view, that's prevailed, but Napoleon's.